All right, we are live. Okay, so rejoining me today, two very special guests, Bernardo Kastrup and Philip Goff. Guys, you want to say a little bit about who you are and what you do, just for fun?
Go on, Bernardo.
I am an amateur philosopher compared to Philip. Shall we put it that way?
You don't need to be modest.
I do have a PhD in philosophy, but I don't work in academia. I run a philosophy organization, but not in academia. I also have a degree in computer engineering, which we were just talking about offline before we went live. And I write books, mostly about ontology, philosophy of mind, and have known Philip now for over 3 years. 3 years and a little bit. Yep, that's it.
Is your organization up and running now? I thought it was in the last discussion. It was in the planning stages, and now it's in existence.
Oh, well, it exists. It's registered. It's official, but we don't have an online presence yet because we are trying to do all the homework we need to do so that when we come out nice, if we know what I mean.
Is it going to be like a 501c or is it a nonprofit or is it?
Yeah, it's a 501c. Well, the Dutch equivalent.
Uh-huh.
What's a 501c?
It's a non-profit organization.
Yeah, tax exempt status, all that good stuff.
Yeah, and we can receive donations and people can have tax discounts if they donate, things like this.
Do you have a name?
Essentia Foundation. Yeah, to appeal to essence and not behavior.
Yeah. Cool.
Very cool.
Essences.
Yeah.
Very good. I'm Philip Goff. I'm a philosopher at Durham University, into consciousness and lots of other things.
And conscience. Don't forget conscience, Philip.
My paperback in my book, US paperback, is out. If I'm allowed to plug that, October 6th. It's the paperback's already out in the UK, but just
I have the paperback version. I guess I must have got
the UK has always been paperback, the white one, but unless you got the preprint things.
Yeah, I don't know what I got.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining me again, you guys. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. I learn a lot and have fun as well. So that's bonus. And I appreciate you having the time. It's a little bit of short notice, but hey, it's all good here. So I guess, and I also have to apologize a little bit because I'm in the middle of a tremendous allergy attack.
Me too.
So so good. We'll commiserate. But if I sneeze or run away or start running, I just want to get that out there. So sorry. It's been tremendously terrible. September always is. But anyway, so all right. So I have a couple of things that I wanted to ask you guys about, but I know that Philip specifically wanted to sort of start the conversation off talking about something. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Philip. You ask a question and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Okay. So just, I guess, finishing off from the discussion last time, the one thing I wanted to talk about, and actually I wanted to talk about the discussion we had the time before that. The topic moved on. Was just to ask Bernardo, I guess, about, well, it's the issue of why I think the body rather than the brain is the seat of consciousness, or to put it in idealist terms, why I think the body rather than the brain is the manifestation, the external manifestation of the human consciousness, of the alter. And so then in our last discussion, Bernardo said, well, we know from experience that the boundary of the skin is the boundary which we can be affected. If you put a pin in your toe, then it hurts. If you put a pin in the ground in front of you, it doesn't hurt. And I think elsewhere he's written, I mean, if you think about the other direction, you might think it's the limit of what we can affect. If I will for my arm to go up, my arm goes up. But if I will this table to go up, nothing's going to happen, or something did happen. But why can't, so what's wrong with this slightly modified form of analytic idealism, Bernardo's view, where the brain is the external manifestation of the alter, but the brain stands in an incredibly close and intimate causal connection with the region of cosmic consciousness that manifests as my body. So just take my case. And so, when you put a pin in the region of cosmic consciousness that manifests as my toe, a causal chain is set off that eventually makes my alter, which is the thing that manifests as a brain, feel pain, or if I will the region of cosmic consciousness that manifests as my arm to go up, a causal process starts that results in that the arm going up. So yeah, so it seems, yeah. So I guess I'm just curious. I mean, I've got a couple of reasons, I guess, to prefer the body, the brain, but in the first instance, I'm just curious about clarifying, Bernardo's motivation for going the body rather than the brain, whereas his view seems equally compatible with both. It seems to me, at least.
I can speak to my reasoning of my intuition about this. I recognize part of your motivation for questioning this, which is what we feel is what happens to our nervous system, and our nervous system extends to the boundary of the skin. But if we didn't have nerve terminations on the boundary of the skin, we wouldn't feel anything touch our skin. We don't have nerve terminations in our hair, so we can cut our hair without pain, or in our nails. We don't have nerve terminations there. So this could lead to the hypothesis that well, the image, the extrinsic appearance of the alter is the nervous system, and the body is just a support infrastructure. I have had this thought. I ultimately didn't pursue it for embryological reasons, of all things. The entire body starts from a zygote, a single cell after fertilization. And all the different tissues in our body, whether they are related to the nervous system or not, arise from that undifferentiated ultimate stem cell, the zygote. Our nervous system actually is a differentiation from the external surface of a 3-week-old embryo that sort of folds in on itself, creates a tube, which later becomes your nervous system, your spine, and gives rise to your brain. In our brain, a lot of the cells, maybe half of it, are not neurons. They are glial cells. They are there for insulation, mechanical support, removal of waste, and they are not nerve cells at all. But they also arise together with neurons from the same stem cell type. So because of that, because all the differentiated tissues in our body, whether they are neuronic or not, I was about to say neurotic, whether they are neuro or not, they have this common source. They differentiate from a common source. And because of that, I thought it would be very difficult to argue that the nervous system is of a essentially different nature than the rest of the body, because their origin is the same. They are differentiations from the same stem, literally the same stem cell, the same zygote. So yeah, that's my motivation.
But couldn't it be that, yeah, I mean, so there's a certain kind of unity and integration to the body, and it results from the same, but it seems to me completely empirically possible that, again, putting it in the framework of your theory, that disassociation happens when in some system in the brain or something that's quite developed. So it's so until you've got cosmic consciousness. I mean, before that you've got just cosmic consciousness and these processes that, as you say, are sort of have a common origin, are part of cosmic consciousness, and then when you get decombination, that just happens when the brain is developed at a certain point. I mean, what is there empirically to rule that out, or
I don't know whether we can rule it out empirically. So I'm appealing to my subjective value system. These processes have a common origin. The whole thing starts during fertilization. These cells share the same genetic code. If you screw up with your heart, your whole body will die together. And it seems to be an integral system with one same common origin. So to argue that, okay, there is an origin there, but after that origin, after some development, then there is an ad hoc process that comes on top of that, which is the dissociation, and that applies only to a subset of that system that in all other ways fully integrated with a common origin. This doesn't feel right to me. Philosophy, unfortunately, is not like science or engineering or the markets. We don't have a objective way to validate. Well, often we don't have an objective way to validate our hypotheses or even our values. Like in engineering, you know, you may think you have a wonderful idea, and then you implement it, it doesn't work. Yeah, it doesn't matter how wonderful it was, man, it just doesn't work. Or in science, when the experiments contradict your brilliant theory, like supersymmetry, which I spent a couple of years of my life hunting for and failed like the rest of the world.
Higher energy levels, Bernardo.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, we get there one day, right? That's what people always say. Oh, we don't know quite yet. Maybe with the superconducting super collider and another few $1 billion. But anyway, so I don't have a way to really objectively validate what I'm saying. But I would suggest that what the empirical evidence shows to us is that we would need a particularly strong reason to differentiate brain, certainly the brain, also the nervous system, from the rest of the body, given the way they seem to be so totally integrated in so many ways, and the fact that they have had a common origin in the zygote.
It's very interesting. Now, it's sort of like almost Aristotelian. I think it reminds me of the things when I talk to neo-Aristotelians, they focus on the sort of integration of the body and the natural unity. And well, I mean, maybe I could just raise that, I guess, two considerations that push me in the other direction. So one is more philosophical, to do with vagueness. So vagueness in the technical sense of things that admit of borderline cases. So you know, tallness is a vague property, that there's no exact height when someone's, you know, above which someone's tall and below which someone's not tall. There are borderline cases. Or baldness, I may be a borderline case of, maybe I'm definitely bald now, but you know, there's no exact number of hairs that makes a bald person. And so I'm inclined to think, I think Bernard, well, you could tell me, I'm inclined to think anyway, consciousness and notions around here are not vague. So for example, you know, it is an utterly, it's not a vague matter whether something is in my consciousness or not. I'm either feeling it or I'm not. And why is this a problem in this case? Because biological boundaries are vague, it seems to me. There's always going to be a vague boundary around the body. You know, is this skin cell in my body or out of my body? There's always going to be and these, you know, create lots of paradoxes and stuff. So I guess the argument, to put it sort of syllogistically, would be like the boundaries of the body are vague, but the boundaries of consciousness, of my consciousness, are not vague. So, well, that's not a syllogism, but that, you know, you can see where that's going, that they're not, they can't be the same thing. I don't know. Anyway, I mean, I'm springing that on you, that it's just a completely different consideration, but that would be one.
I'm hearing you. I could try to argue the other way, just for the sake of enriching the discussion. I would say that the boundaries of all inanimate objects are not only vague, they are purely nominal. There is no objective criteria for saying that an object finishes here and the other object finishes there. Where does the river end and the ocean begin? Is a rock glued to a mountain part of the mountain? Does it become a separate object if it detaches and rolls down the slope? You know, Freya Matthews already argued for this in 2011, saying that all boundaries between inanimate objects are purely nominal, not empirical. But in that same paper, she does argue that the boundaries of consciousness are empirical. There is a limit to what you feel, like we discussed earlier.
Empirical? Did you mean to say empirical then?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure she used this exact word.
I thought you were going to say non-vague. Okay, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I don't think she talks about vague and non-vague. She uses it. I think she uses the term empirical.
Indeterminate.
I may be wrong on this. Have to look it up again. You know the paper I'm referring to, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
2011, Freya Matthews, and then. So I think of all things in nature, the boundaries of our bodies are one of the best defined boundaries. They are not nominal. I mean, if you die, certain things will die with you and certain other things will not. Your chair will not decompose if you die, but the stuff that does decompose, that's your body. And what doesn't decompose by virtue of you having died was not your body. Now, the other thing you mentioned was that the boundaries of our consciousness are not vague. I could argue against that as well. I think if you engage in the discipline of introspection, quickly you come to the conclusion that actually it is quite vague, because there are things that you are experiencing and you don't know that you are experiencing, but if you introspect, oh yeah, I have been experiencing this for quite a while now. There are phenomena of obfuscation. Attention does this a lot. Attention brings the focus of our awareness to a certain region, but it also obfuscates everything else. If you are in the flow writing a paper, you will be experiencing things in your peripheral vision, but they will sort of be obfuscated and you'll not be able to tell yourself that you're experiencing them. So yeah, I think the discipline of introspection, if practiced consequently, can indicate that even the boundaries of our own consciousness can be vague at the level of metacognition. I don't think they are ultimately vague, but it's difficult to say what you're really feeling, what you're really experiencing, and what you're not sometimes.
Well, yeah, I'd like to talk about both of those points, really. I mean, maybe we can come back to, I mean, I still think, I agree that almost every inanimate object has vague boundaries, but I think plausibly the body does too. It's hard to see why there could be an exact fact about whether this skin cell is part of my body, or, you know, when it's dying, or, you know, so it's hard to see how there could be precise boundary. But on the second point, I mean, I kind of agree with you that if you're talking about what you call metacognition, yeah, there could be vagueness about whether I'm, you know, reflectively aware of a certain bit of my consciousness or not. But that's different, I think, to whether it's part of my experience or not, whether it's part of what it's like to be me. And I think there are pretty good reasons to think, I mean, I've written a lot on this and it gets more technical, but just, you know, there are famous paradoxes to do in vagueness, like the Sorites paradox most famously. And, you know, most solutions to these rely on the idea that vague concepts admit of sharpenings or precisification. So you could, you know, you could artificially make precise the concept of tallness. You could say, well, I'm going to say, you know, exactly 6 foot is tall. And so you can make these concepts, and that's sort of important for how we respond to these Sorites paradoxes, although it'd be technical to get into that. But I can't see how you can do that. You can precify the concept of being part of my experience. You know, it seems utterly precise as it is. It's not, it's hard. It doesn't seem the kind of concept you could make more or less precise. So that's why, yeah. So it does seem to me the concept of being in my experience is utterly precise, whereas the boundaries of the body are not precise. And so, yeah. So I still think the problem.
If you had a dream that you no longer remember, is it part of your experience?
Well, I
or
mean,
is
the
it vague?
experience is no. I mean, I'm not talking about, that's to do with memory, then, isn't it? I'm talking about like what's actually in your experience right now.
Yeah, but I would argue that what is actually in your experience right now it tends to nothingness, because the bulk of your experience is memory. What happened 0.1 second ago is memory. So actually 0.00001 second ago is memory. And you can go down to the Planck scale on this.
Yeah.
And you see that the bulk of your experience is memory. So if you don't remember a dream that you had, per hypothesis, is that part of your personal experience? You know, and the boundaries of the body are everything that arose from that original zygote, directly or indirectly, and has your DNA and is burning ATP, in other words, metabolizing. I would say that's your body, and what's not, including the keratin in your nails and your hair, is not. That's just attached to it. It's part of the waste of your body that remains glued to it for mechanical reasons for a little while before they detach further. But anyway, I understand your point.
Things become part of the process and leave the process, don't they? You know, and I think there's always going to be vague boundaries of what is part of the metabolizing process and what is not. And actually, I mean, talking of Aristotelianism, I mean, one of the greatest works of Peter van Imwagen, who famously defends in his book Material Beings that there are only material particles and organisms. Everything else doesn't exist. So he thinks paradoxically that there are no such thing as apples, but there are apple trees. But anyway, but because of this problem, he ends up saying there is real vagueness in reality to do with living creatures.
Can I just ask a question here, because
for lots of ways, but yeah,
I guess I'm a little bit confused about what the issue is supposed to be. I mean, I understand the issue about boundaries. I think that's important. Actually, Philip, I think it may cause some problems for you as well, with respect to phenomenal inheritance or whatever. So maybe we'll get to that. But anyway, so let's see. I feel like I'm the outside. I'm a little bit trying to figure out how to work my in here. Is it fair to say that this issue that you guys are discussing, can I relate it to the embodied mind thesis? So is the claim here that, you know, like the traditional neuro person who thinks consciousness somehow involves just the brain versus the embodied mind person who thinks, no, it extends beyond the brain, maybe and into the environment. Is that a separate question, or is that related to this question?
Sounds separate, I think. Well, I mean, I guess there's three views, isn't there? There's one is the mind is the brain, which I'm inclined to. One is the mind is the body, which I think is something closer to Bernardo's view. One is that the mind is the brain, the body, and the external world. It stretches into the external world.
And depends also on what we mean by mind. You mean the personal mind, the individual mind.
I talk about subjects, you know, conscious subjects. But yeah, I mean,
so the embodied mind thesis is the second of those, and the extended mind thesis is the third.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I wasn't asking about the extended mind thesis yet, although I'm just asking. So is the debate? So does sound like it's right. The debate here is whether the mind is coextensive, what the alters or whatever, however you want to phrase that, the subjects, whatever, is coextensive with the brain or the body.
Right. And I'm saying is a problem with saying it's the body is the boundaries of the alter or whatever you want to say are not vague, whereas the boundaries of the body are vague. So yeah, that's the argument. But
and Bernardo, your response, I mean, so I understand your point about the metacognition and vagueness coming in at the higher level, but I thought I heard you say that at the sort of just experiential level, there's no vagueness.
In terms of perceptual capabilities, there's no vagueness. As Philip said in the beginning, if I stick my chair with a pen, I will not feel it, but if I stick my arm, I will feel it. And you can argue that that's actually the extent of the nervous system and not the body. And then I made the argument that, well, they are two sides of the same thing because they both have the same biological origin in the zygote and the part of the same organism, the same integrated unit. But I do think that the individual mind, or the alter in my terminology, is coextensive with the physical body. Yeah, because that's what is amenable to our direct willing, like Philip described. Now I can will my arm to move, but I can't will the chair across the room to move unless I touch it with my arms. And also the boundaries of our perception. What I can feel is what's happening in my body. I would go beyond that, and you know, modern medicine, begrudgingly as the case may be, is finding very significant connections between mind and body at surprising levels. There is data now showing that, for instance, repressed anger correlates with colitis, a certain kind of intestinal infection, and even cancer. The placebo effect is now broadly recognized, not understood, but recognized as an effect. There are forms of therapy that are related to the body, certain forms of massage or body touching that are meant to have a psychological effect. So yeah, but I think, you know, everything indicates to me that the body and the alter, they have a very tight relationship. I think one is the image of the other, the extrinsic appearance of the other, observed from a certain perspective.
Yes, I mean, on the first, I mean, just briefly on the first point, I mean, I'm inclined to think that that's a sort of illusion created by the fact that there's such a close causal connection between the body and the brain. So I think when you're an infant, I've got a small infant at the moment, you know, you don't know what the hell you can do, and you just, you know, it's a buzzing, blooming confusion, to use William James' phrase. But then in development, you come to represent the capacities you have as possible action. You come to represent, your experience comes to represent experience, and your choices you come to represent as possible choices in the environment. So I think, actually I think what we have a capacity to do is to make changes in our brain, but we learn through development to represent those possible choices, not as things we do in our brain, but as things we can do in the environment because of the close causal connection. Yeah, so.
But then you have to account for the common origin of both things, right? Because your body arises from one single fertilized cell. So what you're seeing is that two separate but interrelated processes arise at that point, but they are not the same process, even though everything in our body is differentiated from the same origin.
Say that again. What's the problem here? I don't get this.
The nervous system and the rest of our body arise from the zygote, from the fertilized human egg cell. And they arise from that through cell division. So if you say that the nervous system and the body are different, causally interrelated, but different, then these different processes had not only a parallel origin, but the same origin in space and in time. I find it difficult to account.
I just don't see a reason to think that means the whole thing's conscious, rather than it could be. I take it to be an empirical, and this is maybe what the other thing I wanted to say. I take it to be an empirical question. What are the necessary and sufficient? So yeah, maybe this is, so the vagueness is one worry, but I guess my broader methodological point about how we do the science of consciousness, I sort of think there's an empirical bit, and then there's a philosophical or more theoretical bit. The empirical bit is we get neuroscientists to find the neural correlates of consciousness, and I'm meaning neural correlates there in a way that's consistent with idealism. You could just think of them as how that bit of cosmic consciousness manifests or whatever. But and I think they do that by trying to find out the best systematization of the correlates we know to exist between certain processes. And so they find that that's the empirical bit, and then you hand that over but that's not an explanation, that's just correlation. Then you hand that over to philosophers to get the best explanation of why those correlations obtain. So I would look to so you're asking, so I just think I look to that empirical job that we've learned to do quite well, we're learning to do better, to tell me what the necessary and sufficient conditions for local consciousness are, and then I as a philosopher try and explain them. So I don't, so you seem to be assuming on some sort of philosophical grounds that life is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, whereas I think that's a mistake. I think it's an empirical question for neuroscientists. What are the conditions that are necessary and sufficient for emergent consciousness?
Just one, before Bernardo responds, just one way to, I think, put this point slightly differently is that I would want to see a type of experience that could only be had with the body. So some of these things, like there's a close connection between the body and so forth, that's fine. But if one assumes that if one tickles the brain the right way, you get the same experience. So if the sort of body is the locus, then you would expect that there would be kinds of experience that just could not occur without the body being present. And that's an empirical question.
Arguably, well, let me make just because I have a list of comments in my mind. I'll just put the list out there. I think your critique regarding vagueness, Philip, applies to the brain as well, applies to the nervous system. Well, where does the brain start? Where does it end? Whatever you say of the body in this regard, you can say of the brain in the nervous system. Another point, I think my motivation is also empirical. What you talked about regarding neuroscience, I think, again, we discussed this already, we have to be careful about the distinction between metaconsciousness and consciousness. All the neurocorrelates of consciousness that are derived from subjective reports, from people saying, well, I'm having this experience now, those are neurocorrelates of metaconsciousness, introspectively accessible experiences. Neuroscience itself now for 5 years has this new paradigm, the no report paradigm, in which they are trying to find out what experiences people have without knowing that they have, and therefore they cannot report. So that I agree with you, that's an empirical question, but it's a subtle empirical question as well. It's not so clear cut because of this distinction between consciousness and introspective, phenomenal consciousness and introspective access. And to finalize, I understand where you're coming from because I read your latest paper. So your position is that life itself is the appearance of a mental process in mind at large, not an individual mental process. And that at some point, the individual mind sort of inherits those experiences from mind at large. If I understood you correctly, I think.
Let's put it in a bit of an idealist way. I prefer not to put it in that idealist way,
Okay.
But it's possible that this is just different ways of describing the same view as we mentioned last time. So I'm
okay.
happy.
Assuming that I'm more or less correct in how I assessed your view now.
Just one qualification. I think, you know, no, I mean, I think I intend the view to be neutral on whether life is. I think my view could be interpreted like your view. It seems to me could be interpreted both with life being the seat of consciousness or brain. I guess I talk in the paper as though it's the brain, you know, but you could equally have. It's supposed to be neutral on that. As I say, I think it's an empirical question. Sorry to interrupt you. Just because you said, is that a correct characterization? So just, yeah. Making that correction.
No problem. But okay, I think the essence of your view is that mind at large has all the experiences, and what we call individual minds just inherit a subset of those experiences from mind at large, or universal consciousness, whatever you want to call that. So from that perspective, I understand you want to find a subset of the body that corresponds to our individual experiences, because the body itself, or at least some part of it, corresponds to a transpersonal process, a mental process in a broader context of subjectivity, so to say. It's not really ours. What we see as ourselves is just a subset of some of the experiences of that process that we happen to inherit. I don't think this is an incoherent view, but it entails saying that in the field of phenomenality of universal consciousness, there are multiple, actually gazillions of points of view being concurrently experienced. I don't think this is incoherent, because we also see the world through two eyes. And for objects that are very close to our faces, those are very different points of view. So I don't think it's incoherent, but it's at least difficult to imagine or to explicitly conceive of what it must be like to be universal consciousness, experiencing those gazillions of points of view at the same time. And you also require sort of an operational distinction between the individual mind and the birth of the organism. They do not overlap now. Now they are different things. I also find that I don't like it. It violates my sense of elegance.
I'm not sure. So I don't think you quite characterized the view right. So the view is supposed to be neutral on whether the brain or the body is the seat of consciousness. You could have, you could have the same view, but it's the whole body that inherits streams of consciousness from more fundamental level. It could be that, I mean, I am inclined to think it's the brain, and I talk about it's the brain. That's probably the more common view, but it's equally, so as I say, that's to me is an empirical question. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for local emergent consciousness? And I suppose that's my objection to you, that you seem to be giving an answer to that on philosophical grounds, whereas I think it should be an empirical question. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for local emergent consciousness?
I agree.
Yeah.
But my view is empirical.
But you're assuming it's biological because of some philosophical
biology is an empirical
about, you know.
No, but biology is an empirical observation. I haven't seen any individual consciousness that wasn't alive yet. See, it is such a. It's so evident that it's an empirical question that we almost don't see anymore that it's empirical. We try to find some subset of that to call empirical, but to associate individual consciousness with birth and life is a massively empirical thing to do. It's acknowledging the overt facts of nature. Before your kid was born, there was no individual consciousness for you to call your kid by.
I don't think biology tells us that life is coextensive with consciousness. That's a philosophical argument about integration and, you know, connected with Aristotle, and I mean, you know, related to that sort of tradition, I don't think it's, so it doesn't seem to me your motivation is, I don't know. But
so you might be just using the word empirical in two different ways here. It seems like, because I agree, we have lots of evidence that consciousness is associated with living beings, because as you say from Bernardo, that's all that we've ever seen, is we haven't met a conscious non-living entity as of yet. I wouldn't rule that out, but depending on your views about artificial life and AI and stuff, maybe they could be conscious and not living. I don't know. So anyway, but I think what Philip is after is, so, you know, take the simplest case of like phantom limb pain. You might have, so the naive view is that the pain is in the arm. And then you discover phantom limb pain and you realize, well, you can have that very same experience without the arm. So the pain has got to be somehow not in the arm, but merely represented as being in the arm. That's kind of a conclusion of some, that's an empirical discovery. And so then you might look into the brain and say, okay, what activity in there is it actually? Oh, it's in this, you know, blah, blah, blah area of the brain. And so now we have a hypothesis about the neural correlate of the experience of having a pain in the arm. And so we would want to see which parts of the body or organism are necessary and sufficient for generating that kind of experience. And so that's a different sense of empirical than, you know, the sense that I thought you were invoking. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that what we'd want to find is a kind of experience that you could not have without the body around. And so far, as of right now, I don't really see that. I mean, maybe we haven't been looking for it, but I don't think the neuroscience supports that view.
Then you'd have to separate the nervous system from the body to answer that question empirically, which we haven't had yet a brain that functions without the body that maintains and supports it and keeps it going. You know, the digestive system that provides energy to it, the heart that keeps it oxygenated. So okay, I understand the point in principle, but again, I would insist on, if you're talking about the empirical correlates of individual awareness, I would insist on that differentiation between phenomenal consciousness and conscious metacognition. Otherwise, we fall into a dangerous.
I appreciate.
So, I was just going to ask quick. So Bernardo, you have a view that's like brain in the bats, they wouldn't have experiences?
Theoretically, I think that is possible, but empirically, I haven't seen one yet. That was my point. If we appeal to empiricism, we cannot appeal to theoretical future observations. That's not empiricism. You have to appeal to something that has been observed, and we haven't seen a brain in a vat yet. Do I think it is impossible? I don't think it is impossible, but I think if theoretically, let's do a thought experiment. If I close my eyes and I focus on my experiences right now with my whole body, and then I would be turned into a brain in the vat and I would introspect, I think my experiences would be different.
Even if the inputs were kept the same?
Even if...
so from an external source that wasn't the body?
Yes, and now I'm running against that very danger I just pointed out. To what extent will I be able to introspect into the whole set of my experiences in order to ascertain that it's different? Because the assumption here is that I would be able to fully introspect. In practice, we can't fully introspect. There are decades of research in psychology showing that we cannot ever fully introspect. There are things that remain beyond the boundary of introspection. But if I could fully introspect, then I would say, even if the inputs were identical, then the experience would still be different, because I think there is a non-introspective experience in my individual mind whose extrinsic appearance is my liver. There is another whose extrinsic appearance are my kidneys. You see what I mean? So even if you could replicate all the inputs to the brain, I would still lack that experience that corresponds to the liver and the kidneys and the rest of my body. But I don't think those experiences are introspectable. You cannot explicitly introspect into them. There may be even a hierarchy of dissociation within the organism that would prevent that from happening. But again, how can we then evaluate that empirically? Well, I have a good friend who is a liver Forgot the exact name of. He studies liver tissue. He
Liverologist.
No, he diagnoses people with liver cancer.
You're so good with words, Richard.
By the way, he's a. It's not pathologist. But never mind. A liver pathologist, maybe he is. He discovered. No, he discovered that new organ in the human body that was discovered 2 or 3 years ago, the interstitium. So he's part of that team who discovered that. And well, I don't want to put words on his mouth, but there is anecdotal evidence that people who undergo organ transplants, including liver transplants, report experiences that they couldn't have had. Not only more direct things like changes in personality, but also memories, experiences in general. Mm-hmm. So is this something that we can certify actually happens? No, because it has not happened under controlled conditions. I don't think there has been a prospective study to pin this down, but there is anecdotal evidence, some of it quite compelling, that an organ transplant that has nothing to do with the nervous system has an impact in what you consider to be your own individual experiences.
Yeah, I'm following up on that. I wonder why you get to rule out things like hair and the nails then, since why don't they count as an experience, the extrinsic appearance of which is hair?
It's just secreted keratin. These are not part of your metabolism. You can look upon them as something that your body has discarded, but it sort of remains glued. And there has been an evolutionary advantage for it to remain glued to your body because they work as good tools. Hair is insulation. Nails literally are tools for you to scratch into.
I understand. I see what you're saying, but I mean, on your view, they nonetheless are experiential, right? They're just an extrinsic experience of something that's experiential.
No, they don't metabolize. There is no metabolism inside your hair or in your nail. It's just secreted keratin. Things that are metabolizing, that I would consider the extrinsic appearance of an inner experience, yeah, whether it's metacognitive or not.
I guess I shouldn't have said inner, but I thought on your view, everything was experiential. Everything was the extrinsic experience of something experiential.
True, but
maybe not your experience.
Exactly. So I'm talking about the inner experience of the alter. I think secreted keratin in my nails is a pixel of the inner life of mind at large, what remains of universal mind after you account for all the alters. So yes, I think all matter under any circumstances is the extrinsic appearance of phenomenal states, experiential states. The question is, within which dissociative boundary are those states? Are they out there or are they within a discernible alter? That's the question. I would think my nails, the tip of my nails are not inside my alter. They are just attached to it like my clothes.
Just on the brain Nevat thing, I don't think Bernardo has to worry about actually. So Peter van Inwagen has a good answer to this. He thinks a brain Nevat is just an organism that's been whittled down to a very small size. You know, you could cut off an arm, you've still got an organism. Cut off 2 arms, and the limit of that he thinks is, just cutting it down to the brain. But
yeah, but that doesn't really answer the problem, though, Philip. It's not. That doesn't address the issue of whether you can have the kinds of experiences would be identical as between you right now and a brain in a vat stimulated artificially to have the sorts of experiences. So Bernardo was saying the answer is no, whereas I would say, I agree it's all fictional at this point, but my intuition suggests that yes, you would have exactly identical. Boltzmann brains would have identical experiences as you.
Yeah, it depends what we're trying to do here. I was just saying that Bernardo's view doesn't have to say there couldn't be brains in bats. It doesn't have to say
I concur, yeah.
Yeah, no, I could agree with that, but the question is whether they have the same experience or not.
Yeah, and I would say,
and he has to say no.
Yeah, I think they wouldn't. Yeah, even if it's not introspectively accessible, I would say no. They don't have the same experiences. Yeah.
On the metacognitive point, so I appreciate that there is that distinction between the possibility of consciousness we don't notice, and that creates all sorts of possible problems. But I sort of think that's the best we've got. And so I make a sharp distinguish between like consciousness we've got pre-theoretical reason to believe in. I think consciousness is everywhere. You think, Bernardo, consciousness is everywhere, but that's not the consciousness we've got pre-theoretical reason to believe in. The consciousness we've got pre-theoretical reason to believe in is what we are aware of, and that's, yeah. So you might say, well, how do we know that's just the stuff we're aware of? But I still think that's all we've got, and all we've got is all we can do is get neuroscientists to try and systematize how that correlates with brain processes, however we understand them metaphysically, and then as philosophers we can try and explain those correlations. So yeah, so back to the point, I suppose, that I think it's an empirical question, you know, what the correlations are, but whereas you're assuming on philosophical grounds, that seems to me illegitimate, that actually it goes along with, you're saying, forget that project, neuroscientists, of neural correlates of consciousness. I've got the answer already from my philosophical reflections that it's life. And I don't know. I think we should be asking the scientists.
Look, at least I try to ground everything I think on empirical data. If there is one noticeable characteristic in terms of style from my work, it's the attempt to always go to empirical data. I think your point would be stronger, Philip, if we did not have cases of retroactive recognition of previously introspectively inaccessible experiences. In other words, if nobody ever had woken up one day and thought, oh my God, I was experiencing that, but I didn't know that that was such. But the annals of clinical psychology are filled to the brim with this kind of insight.
I accept that, but what does that show?
There is a whole lot of experiences that are yours as an individual, as an author in my terminology, which at some point you were not able to introspectively access. And this is empirical.
I haven't denied that. What part of my argument?
Well, when you said that the best we have is what we can introspectively access at this point, I would say no. The best we have are all these instances in the annals of clinical psychology in which people retroactively realized that they were having experiences of their own that back then they couldn't introspectively access, but now on the screen of memory they can.
It's only once they become introspectively accessed that they become part of the empirical data of consciousness that I'm saying is all we have. So yes, I'm not meaning to rule. I accept the distinction, the possibility, and the reality of conscious states we can't attend to, but all we can work with empirical data is those states that we can attend to, maybe including states that we previously couldn't and now we can. And I think we should look to neuroscience to, you know, to take those states that we are aware of, because that's all we've got. Whether we were always aware of them or whether we were previously not, as you say, and then become aware of them, and then systematize that. And it should be the job of scientists to work out the neural correlates of consciousness on that basis.
I mean, yeah, I just want to add too that the no report paradigm is not as new as people think that it is. It's been around for a while, actually. And there's some question about what it shows. Actually, I'm involved with some work right now. We're trying to look into some of these things. But anyway, so let's not get distracted with that. I just would say, don't put too much weight on that, I would say.
Well, at least it's a sign of recognition in neuroscience that there is a legitimate question to be explored here, that we may not be limited to metaconsciousness, that there may be other things going on underneath. And then I would say, look, if we realize, looking back, that a host of people after the fact suddenly realized that they were having experiences that they were not explicitly aware of back then chances are that this is happening right now again. And to not take this into consideration, in a sense, is to disregard the empirical evidence, because the empirical evidence is speaking loudly to us that right now this may be the case again, because it has been the case by many other people in the past.
I'm not ruling out the possibility, but how do you get from that to consciousness is in my toe, or, you know, I mean, I don't know.
I wouldn't characterize it in these terms. I think your toe is part of the image of a conscious process that corresponds to your alter. I don't think consciousness is in your toe, because I don't think your toe has existence independent of consciousness. But anyway,
I'm speaking loosely.
Look, this is precisely what neuroscience is trying to do with the no-report paradigms. This is precisely what depth psychology has been trying to do for over a century now in therapy to bring things to awareness that that are in experience, but people don't explicitly realize, don't acknowledge. So this has been going on for quite a while now.
I'm not denying any of that. I'm accepting all of that. And so what that tells us is that there very well likely is that there are states that we're not immediately attending to, and we should not rule out that possibility. But at the same time, all we can deal with scientifically are those states we can attend to.
I disagree.
No?
I disagree.
But
I think.
What else have we got to go on?
Well, if you look at the pattern of experiential states that people were not explicitly aware of and became aware of after therapy or what neuroscience is learning with the no-report paradigms, we can identify those patterns. We can identify the likely areas or the likely types or kinds of experiences that are being experienced but are not being explicitly recognized in metacognition. I think that there's a broad set of data that gives us indications to those patterns.
I would say that's consistent with what I'm saying. That's still, yeah, it's working with the data states that have become recognized that were previously not. That's consistent with what I'm saying. I'm just saying
all we have is what we can immediately attend to, and I'm saying no, that's not all we have. We have
I explicitly said a moment ago, including states that previously were not attended to. Yet that's part of the data. But we should look to neuroscientists working with all of that data to tell us science's best guess as to what is necessary and sufficient conditions for local emergent consciousness. Whereas what seems to me you're doing is you're just ignoring that science and saying on philosophical grounds, I think life is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And I think that's philosophy overreaching itself. I think this is a case where we should be looking to neuroscience to do that job.
It's the first time anyone ever accused me of not being extremely empirical in how I go about things. It's kind of peculiar. I'm not all for neuroscience. I think we should go and listen to what neuroscience has to say. I think
but not on this.
This too, in this too, particularly in this, if anything. I think the no-report paradigms will open lots of doors if that avenue is pursued consequently. But at the same time, there is an obvious empirical correlation between individual conscious agency and living organisms. And that agency seems to disappear when the living organism disappears. And there seems to be also a direct relation between what happens in the body of that living organism and the experiential states of that living organism. And by the way, the nervous system and the body arose from the same single cell, the zygote, after fertilization. So I've been throwing on the table today for the past hour all kinds of empirical things, and then you still turn around and you say, I think you're ignoring the empirical data and you're taking a position purely on philosophical grounds that overrules the empirical data. I find that peculiar, Philip.
Well, these philosophical arguments seem to be about integration and a common source. This is biology. Biology does not tell us that the boundaries of the body are the boundaries of consciousness. That is not a biological claim. There's no peer-reviewed articles in biology journals telling us that. What you're doing is giving a kind of philosophical argument that consciousness should go along with the integration.
No, I think if anybody here is trying to overrule the biology for a philosophical argument, I think it's separating the nervous system from the body. Because I've repeated this now, I don't know how many times today, they both had the same origin. They are differentiated from the same stem cells. It's very hard to draw a wedge between them on the basis of the empirical data from embryology of anything, if anything. So I think that's the consequent empirical approach, is to recognize that as far as empiricism is concerned, brain and anything that can be detected as a correlate of consciousness, whether under no report paradigms or not, is part of the body, and that body is a unity with a single origin. It's very hard to neglect that. So look, none of my positions are motivated, and I know this because I'm me. I may have a hard time convincing you of it, but I know it for myself that none of my positions are based on a priori deliberations of form and elegance. All of my positions are ultimately grounded in what I observe in empirical data. Maybe because my personality is such that I don't have any particular theoretical preference, if you know what I mean. I could never, maybe I had once when I was a teenager, I don't know, but it's not, I noticed over time that other people do have it. Part of me is jealous of that, but I'm kind of bare. I'm kind of sort of, you know, not very colorful in that regard. So everything I've been saying is based on empirical observations, including the most obvious ones, which is the nervous system is part of the living metabolizing body.
Yeah, but nobody's denying that. I mean, it's I'm not denying that there's a unified integrated system here, and that the later parts of the body emerge from the initial sperm and egg, and there's obviously a unified process. It's consistent with that to saying it's only later stages of that process or parts of that process that are necessary and sufficient for local emergent consciousness. That's completely consistent with the empirical facts. You're suggesting it's shown by the biology, or no, it's shown by your philosophical intuitions about integration, and because it has a common source.
Wait, Philip. I think what he's saying is that it sounds ad hoc to make that distinction that you just made
between.
So
why is that ad hoc?
Well, because they come from the same origin. So the same cell differentiates into these two different things. So why would one of them have the property that the other one doesn't? Is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Bernardo say.
It sounds like these genetic arguments for panpsychism that, like, William James made, that there's a continuous evolutionary process. It's crazy to think consciousness emerges. Okay, that's an interesting argument, but that's a philosophical argument. That's about that's not what you get in a biology textbook.
I think your argument would be okay under a materialist perspective, because then you could say it's not the entire body that generates consciousness. It's only particular arrangements or particular patterns of firings in the nervous system that generate consciousness. But the moment you concur with me that the body is the appearance of a process in consciousness, the moment you take materialism out of the equation, then it's very hard to make that distinction between a process in consciousness that corresponds to the rest of the body and another process in consciousness that corresponds to the nervous system, even though they had the same origin and they were differentiated from the same original process, which was had the image of the zygote. You see what I mean? So if I think under a materialist paradigm and I ponder what you're saying,
I'm not sure I see the
intuitive.
difference. I don't see the difference, actually. Even if you're a materialist, you could make the same argument that, and these are arguments that people made starting from materialism to a kind of panpsychism, saying, look at this continuous process. I've got a paper making this kind of, it's getting back to vagueness arguments in a way. There's a continuous process. Why think that later parts of it involve consciousness, but earlier parts, I mean, why can't you say that as a materialist? I don't see the difference.
Okay, as a materialist, only certain things might generate consciousness in the body and other things not. But what you're saying is that there is a process in universal consciousness that does not lead to individual awareness, and that corresponds to most of the body. And then in parallel to that, there is another process in consciousness that does correspond to individual awareness. And you try to put the boundary around the nervous system or the brain. There's an argument for vagueness in that as well. But you don't have the elegance of the materialist in this regard by saying that, okay, only certain things generate consciousness. For you and me, everything is in consciousness. And then if there is one process in consciousness that corresponds to birth, how do you drive a wedge between what is then a universal experience and what is an individual experience, even though there is an obvious common origin, an obvious chain of derivation from the same origin in there?
Well, because I think it's an empirical scientific question. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness? And it could be that there is, to put it in your terms, there's birth is a process within universal consciousness. The emergence of the body is within universal consciousness, or in my terms, it's just physical. And at some point, you get the necessary and sufficient conditions that are suitable for emergent local consciousness. I just don't want to be deciding that on philosophical grounds. And I think we should ask neuroscience. We we should decide it on neuroscientific grounds. There is a project to find the neural correlates of consciousness, which it seems to me you must concede you're ignoring that, because you're just saying, I think it's. Well, how do you not see that, Richard? Because he's just saying, no, I know that it's by life is necessary and sufficient for consciousness.
No, I don't know that. I'm making a hypothesis.
Yeah, okay, but it's not a hypothesis where it makes the search for the neural correlates of consciousness redundant, right? That's attempt to find. I don't know. I'm surprised you disagree with that, Richard. Sure. If the project of trying to find.
If you reason from Bernardo's position, then I obviously I'm on the other side of the fence. I mean, I have an open mind. I'm a materialist with an open mind. So obviously, I'm not a diehard staunch whatever. So the most I've ever defended is that it hasn't been refuted, not that it's true. But anyway, so if you start from a position like Bernardo, so they're both. So the zygote is a metabolizing thing. So it's the extrinsic appearance of something that's experiential. So it differentiates into these two different sorts of processes. So why is one experiential and the other not? There's no explanation for that.
But Philip is going beyond that. What he's saying is, okay, I have to be empirically based when it comes to the range of my individual experiences, and that I should leave to neuroscience. And then he's saying that I'm making a choice for the body as a whole purely on philosophical grounds. But you see, philosophy is here to try to make sense at the level of essence of the processes and the behaviors of nature. I think there is some elegance that can be attributed to the idea that what life is the image of a process of dissociation, because living organisms, insofar as we can tell from first-person experience, have private inner life, which is then dissociated from whatever is going on out there, if there is consciousness out there, which Phillips grants. And then I make sense of that process that we call life, fertilization, embryonic development, birth, that then gets an account at the metaphysical level. I can account for that at the metaphysical level. What Philip is saying is that, okay, there is a process in consciousness whose extrinsic appearance is birth, life, and then there is a separate thing. There's a separate thing that corresponds to what neuroscience can attest to be our individual experiences and the parts of the brain and nervous systems, the nervous system that are involved in that. So you have two processes that are in one way correlated to life, but most of life is still a universal process, or physical, as Philip calls it. And then there is a subset of some patterns of organization in life that are actually individual, and the individual inhabits that sort of island that's not really an island, we call the body, but it's a process in universal consciousness. I find that inelegant, because it seems to me you're trying to drive a sort of artificial wedge into the metaphysical nature of life in here. You're basically saying that universal consciousness develops non-dissociated individual perspectives, and then on top of that non-dissociated individual perspective, there is a dissociated little inner life there that corresponds to the neural correlates of consciousness. I don't think this is an elegant metaphysical account for everything involved here, which is not only consciousness, but the life itself.
I mean,
but that's where I think Philip gets some purchase on you relying on philosophy and non-empirical consideration.
Oh, but ultimately we are doing philosophy. He is doing philosophy. So ultimately, that's what we are doing.
But I look to scientists to do this bit. You're doing this bit with philosophy. I mean, I'm not saying there's no force to that philosophical argument. It's reminiscent of William James' genetic argument for panpsychism that, you know, is more elegant to think consciousness was there all along and it evolved. No, I see what you're saying. It's more elegant to think, you know, there's just this unified process of life and but
I don't grant even that, Philip, because I think we have to account for more than just individual consciousness. If you're doing ontology, we have to account for nature, and nature includes life. You have to account for life as well. How does your view
help us account for life?
I mean, life is the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in universal consciousness.
But how does that help us with our biology? I mean, your view, you could have a version of your view that's exactly the same, except the dissociation happens within some brain processes. It doesn't happen. How does supposing that dissociation happens with life, how does that help us understand life or understand any of those?
I turn it around with a question. how do you account for life if life is not the appearance of a dissociative process related to individual
I
awareness?
account for life. I think
What
it's
is
the
life?
job. I think it's the job of biologists to account for life. I mean, what? No,
then it's the job.
I'm not
Then,
being
but
facetious,
Philip,
what
then
is
it's the job of neuroscientists to account for individual experience, and you're out of a job.
But the difference with because well, I could say very clearly why consciousness is a very different to other scientific problems, because the main source of data is not publicly observable, right? As I'm sure you'd agree. So it's a radically different to any other scientific problem. So all we can do with neuroscientists is look at what is publicly observable, the neural correlates, ask people about their private experiences and correlate the two. So because consciousness is not publicly observable, that's a very special reason why this is a unique scientific problem. I don't see that in biology. What's that? I mean, look, there are mysteries in biology. There are mysteries about how life began. I don't see why those mysteries can't be addressed straightforward scientifically. And I don't see why those mysteries are helped by supposing that this is a process of cosmic dissociation.
Those mysteries have a metaphysical basis as well. They necessarily have a metaphysical basis. Those mysteries, all mysteries have. And I think,
can you give an example of how your helps with the mystery?
The mystery of life. What is life metaphysically? Do you agree that life has a metaphysical basis? Otherwise, it wouldn't exist.
I guess I'm not convinced why there couldn't just be, a mechanistic account of life.
I mean, no one even knows what life is. So that, I mean, that's sort of what I wanted to ask Bernardo is, so suppose that we built an artificial system that responded to the environment, like a really advanced Roomba robot. I love Roombas. They're pretty, but a really sophisticated Roomba. It doesn't metabolize though. So does it have experience on your view? Is it alive on your view? So it's not clear to me how wide the net of life is being cast on your view.
In my view, the important question is not to say, yes, does it has inner life or it doesn't, because we don't know. We only know about ourselves. But that's not the important question. The important question is, do we have good reasons to infer that it would also have inner life? That is the important question to ask. And I think we don't have good reasons to think that a silicon computer would have inner life. And I tell you why. By the way, you're talking with somebody who also has a doctorate in computer engineering and has worked on artificial intelligence. So this is close to my heart. I can tell you this with authority. Absolutely every computation performed by the world's most sophisticated artificially intelligent computer can be done in principle with a network of pipes, taps, and water. Everything. Instead of copper wires, it's pipes. Instead of electricity, it's water. Instead of micro switches, it's taps. Now, it would require a circuit of water pipes and taps, maybe the size of a moon. But there would be nothing more to it than taps, water, and pipes. Now, do we have any reason to think that an enormous construction of pipes, water, and taps would be conscious in and of itself? I would say no more reason than to think that my glass of water is conscious in and of itself, that it has private inner life, because ultimately it is pipes, taps, and water. There's nothing more to that. Now, because we put it in a silicon chip that then is covered by a layer of epoxy in a package, and most people don't know what's going on inside, it's a mystery. And because it's a mystery, anything becomes plausible. People don't know what's going on inside. It's some kind of magic. So for all I know, it may have a conscious inner life in and of itself. But then when you talk to somebody like me, who not only designed computers, but for the past 15 years, I worked in the manufacturing of the most advanced silicon chips, I bloody know what's in there. I saw it every day for 15 years. And I can tell you, it's just like pipes, taps, and water.
But why should that matter, though? Because, I mean, suppose you had suppose there was on the moon a system of pipes and all this kind of stuff, and it was by some kind of radio connected to an android body here on Earth, and it was walking around and it said, I love chocolate, I feel pain, don't turn me off. Wouldn't that give us reason to think that it's conscious, no matter what its internal mechanisms were?
Ultimately, it's a subjective call. So I would phrase the question the following way. Do you, in your heart of hearts, see a good reason to think that a huge construction consisting solely of pipes, taps, and flowing water could have a conscious inner life of its own? that's the right question and the right way to formulate it. The answer is your own. The answer to me is obviously not. If I grant that, then I grant animism. I don't have more reason to think that a big system of pipes, taps, and water is conscious than I have to think that the system of pipes, taps, and water of my house has a conscious inner life in and of its own. But the only conscious inner life I know is my own, and I am a metabolizing organism. And when something goes wrong with my metabolism, something very drastic seems to happen in my conscious inner life. So on an empirical basis, I don't see reason to think that things other than metabolizing organisms, and even that, I attribute that by analogy, I don't think anything that is not a metabolizing organism, I don't think I have good reasons to infer that it has a conscious inner life of its own. Certainly not silicon computers, doesn't matter how sophisticated they are.
Again, it's you decide in these things on philosophical intuitions. You're saying,
no,
just let me finish the point. Do we think, things with pipes and no, and you said it's a subjective call. I don't think we should be deciding in that way. We should be looking to, we've got well-developed neuroscientific project of finding the NCCs. They should do that job and forget the philosophical intuitions, although there are philosophical difficulties. And then as philosophers, we, explain why those correlations obtain. But
I think this is an eminently philosophical project in this specific case. Otherwise, what you'll get is the following. And by the way, what I'm about to describe actually happens. People will find out what the abstract patterns of information flow are in the human brain when the human subject reports to be explicitly aware of certain experiences. And then we make a little model of that and we call it IIT. And then we abstract that from its substrate and we start saying, well, maybe the internet will be conscious because the same patterns of information flow are there. Now, that's a philosophical step already. It is not a scientific step because once you replace the substrate, the only reasons you have left to continue to attribute the same property for the same pattern in another substrate are philosophical reasons. They are not scientific reasons. We do not have scientific reasons to think that the internet is conscious, even if it has closed loops of information integration, because the substrate of the internet is totally different from the substrate where we observed the correlations in the first place based on subjective reports of experience, namely the metabolizing substrate of the human brain. Look, I like to use this analogy. I can do an incredibly accurate simulation of kidney function on my computer down to the molecular levels, but that will not make my computer urinate on my desk because a simulation of a phenomenon is not the phenomenon. It's a simulation of the bloody phenomenon.
In some cases, a simulation is a phenomenon, like a computer. For a simulation of a computer is a computer. So maybe the mind is more like a computer than urination.
But then I would say that if the simulation of a computer is a computer, yes, but then it's a computer before it is a simulation of a computer. Do you understand what I mean?
Even if it's not simulated on a computer, a simulation of a computer is still a computer.
No, you're starting from the identity, and then you're attributing an extra fact that it's also a simulation of itself. I can attribute that fact to everything. I am a simulation of you because I'm also a person. Know what I mean? But the identity starts first. We have an identity. We are both human, biological, metabolizing human beings. If you say a computer is a simulation of a computer, well, there is a semantic sense in which this is true, but there is an identity first. It is a computer. Before it's a simulation of a computer, it is a computer. See what I mean?
It could be done with water and pipes, though. By the way, just for the record, I defend the view. I mean, obviously, I'm an identity theorist. I defend the view that biology is important, the substrate is important. So I'm more on Bernardo's side on this debate than maybe it's coming across. But I just
that's not the. Can I just say that's not the debate? And so I don't know. I think the debate's got a bit sidetracked. That's not. I'm not taking a side on functionalist versus substrate. I'm just saying it's a scientific question, and I appreciate there are philosophical issues there. But we should decide. There should be philosophically informed neuroscientists trying to answer that question rather than philosophers. I'm really gonna have to go in a few minutes. I just looked at the time and we've carried away with such fun discussion.
Just to conclude, I agree with what you said. It's just that my position is such that I think we cannot cherry pick the science. We have to look at the entire broad context of science, because ultimately you're trying to explain nature. You cannot explain consciousness without finding a place for it in nature. What is its place in nature? How do you make sense of the ontological essence of everything else, including biology, including the inanimate universe? So it seems to me that what you're trying to do is to isolate the problem in an artificial way and say, I will only look for the neurocorrelates of experience. Why I'm saying no, you have to look at the whole of science, what the whole of science is telling us. One, about the nature of matter through foundations of physics. Two, about the nature of life. What is life? We haven't been able to get it started from non-life yet. What the hell is that? What is the ontological essence of that? What does the process of birth correspond to at a metaphysical level? And three, individual awareness. How does it fit with the rest? So I'm totally with you. I am as pro-science as one can be. I was a scientist before I was a philosopher. I've worked in the great cathedral of science called CERN in Switzerland. But I don't think we can cherry pick and isolate the problem artificially. We may have a focus of research, but you have to be aware of the entire context.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, of course, I agree with that in principle. I'm just not seeing reasons in biology or to think that life is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. Just one other thing I want to throw in. So just you said a long time ago, you know, well, the brain is vague as well, but I mean, not necessarily. Well, obviously the brain, but you know, what is necessary and sufficient in the brain for consciousness might not be vague. So one advantage of IIT, and look, I'm not here to sell IIT. We've all got problems with IIT. I've got a review of Christoph Koch's book where I raise problems with IIT. And but one benefit of it is that it does potentially give a totally non-vague account of when local emergent consciousness happens. You know, it's when you get more integrated information in the whole rather than the parts. That could be utterly precise. So this is my big worry. If you're into these elegance worries, then I think, you know, there's a real worry about vagueness here with any biological system, that there's going to be vagueness at the boundaries, and that just looks inconsistent with the idea that it's a non-vague matter what's in my experience. But if, for example, we could have theory like, and maybe not IIT, but some kind of theory that can give a precise answer to what in the system in the brain is necessary, a non-vague answer necessary and sufficient for consciousness, and that seems, yeah, that would seem to me a more theoretically attractive option. But yeah.
I think metaconsciousness is not vague by definition. It is that which you can explicitly introspect into and report. Metaconsciousness is not vague. The contents of metacognitive awareness are not vague. If you can't report, then by definition, it's not in your metacognitive awareness. And I think IIT gives an account of metaconsciousness because it has been developed based on subjective reports of experience. And then IIT is also non-vague because it's modeling a non-vague process. But that process is not phenomenal consciousness. It's metacognitive awareness.
I didn't want to get in a dispute. That's why I said I'm not here to sell IIT. You're trying to drag me into a dispute about something I'm not trying to argue about. I'm just saying you could, in principle, have a neuroscientific theory which gives you non-vague necessary and sufficient conditions for local emergent consciousness. Whereas if you go for the biology, you're never going to get that, it seems to me. It's always
the key word is in principle. And then I agree with you.
Okay.
Principle. Yes.
Maybe that's a good place to end.
I mean, at least one way to put pressure on some of this is to try to empirically verify some of the things that Bernardo was talking about, like with organ transplants and having whether they make a difference to experience that can't be identified with a change in the brain or something like that. So there is an empiric. So even though I think what he's saying is that maybe considerations of elegance and overall explanatory unity or something like that are what make him think that this is something that's worth investigating. There are empirical predictions and claims.
Yes.
Which can be tested, and so it's not like he's saying by fiat this is it. So it's just a different research program than the one looking just for the correlates in the brain. But still,
but we should look to the empirical stuff, not the sort of pre-theoretic philosophical intuition. But yeah.
But I mean, the same thing is true for you, Philip, though, right? So you have pre-theoretical intuitions, and then you say, well, okay, so neuroscience is going to help me look at those.
No, I'm just saying.
Philip is saying we should look at the.
I'm saying let the neuroscientists do it. I'm saying let you and Hakwan do it.
But the history of your work is the history of philosophical predilections and preferences and considerations of elegance. And of course, I mean, when you talked about the way you explained the fine-tuning was totally based on purely philosophical considerations and nothing remotely related to anything empirical. But anyway,
look, I'm not saying there are not pure. Well, what's that got to do with anything I'm saying? I'm not saying there aren't pure philosophical tasks. I'm saying the job of finding necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness is an empirical task, and I don't really engage with that. It's not my skill set.
You're trying to get across as a complete empiricist, and that's not your history.
Why are you making this into like a personal? I'm not trying to say anything. All I'm saying is my personal view that. It's an empirical job, not a philosophical task, to find the necessary and sufficient conditions of consciousness. I admit I don't really do it very
but Bernardo's agreed with that.
We agree.
Yeah.
We agree. And I think your suggestion,
Richard,
your suggestion was great. Here is a dream research program, a prospective study of organ transplant patients, and then study them with everything we have learned so far from no report paradigms and the methods of clinical depth psychology, which have a much longer history than the no report paradigms. And then we study them based on those premises, because they may have different experiences that they cannot easily introspectively access. So we need clinical psychologists, depth psychologists involved in there to try to bring those things up and the methods of no report paradigms, and then see, does their phenomenal inner life, not only the metacognitive inner life, does their phenomenal inner life change significantly after an organ transplant? That's a way to empirically frame the question and test it. The anecdotal evidence indicates that this is the case, and the anecdotal evidence is extraordinarily compelling in some cases. And we have the philosophical considerations as well to justify this into a logical framework to motivate the research. I would like this to happen, yeah.
Well, we can agree on that. That sounds like a really interesting project. I'm definitely going to have to go and parent. Thanks, Bernardo. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Bernardo.
Yeah, it's been
really
great. We didn't get to talk about the stuff that I was hoping to talk about. So we have to have it round 3, guys. I hate to say
I'm glad I got everything ticked off my list. I wanted to talk about that brain or body stuff on the first meeting, the second meeting. So I'm glad I've got it ticked off my list. But yeah. But thank you very much. I'm really going to have to dash. Sorry.
Thanks, Philip.
No problem. All right, guys.
I can hear
thanks again. I'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Take care.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.